Throughout history, there have been countless examples of queens who were disliked by their own people. From accusations of tyranny and treason, to secrets and scandals. Today, we will be uncovering the lives of some of history's most powerful women, who were reviled even by their own kingdoms. Stay tuned for a journey into the intriguing world of despised queens. For our first tale, we are heading to 18th century Italy, where one young royal would marry her cousin and later become a queen. But her domineering nature and rumours of infidelity gave her a bad reputation. Maria Louisa of Parma was born on the 9th of December 1751 in the city of Parma in northern Italy. At the time, Italy was divided into numerous small states, and in 1748, the Duchy of Parma had been awarded to the royal house of Bourbon. This was thanks to the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which brought the War of Austrian Succession to an end. Different branches of the Bourbons ruled France and Spain, and it was determined that Maria Louisa's father, Philip, the second son of King Philip V of Spain, would acquire the dukedom. Thus, Maria was born in the Italian city just over 2 years after her father had arrived there as Duke of Parma. Maria Louisa's mother was Louise Elizabeth, the eldest daughter of King Louis XV of France. She was closely related to Philip, whom she married in 1739, continuing a tradition of marriage between near cousins amongst Europe's royal families. She and Philip had 3 children who lived into their adult years. Isabella was born in 1741, not long after they were married. 10 years later, in January 1751, a boy Ferdinand was born. Just a few weeks later, Louise Elizabeth fell pregnant, and so Maria Louise was born 11 months later. The 3 children and their parents lived in the Ducal Palace of Colorno in Parma, a fine edifice which had been refurbished and expanded into an 18th century palace from an imposing medieval edifice several decades earlier. Maria Louisa and her 2 siblings were alleged to have been educated by Etienne Bonnot de Condillac, a prominent French Enlightenment scholar, but there is no evidence to substantiate this. Well, Condillac is known to have arrived in Parma in 1768, and by then, Maria Louisa had already left Italy. Before that, the family had experienced some tragedy when Maria Louisa's mother died in 1759, followed by her sister Isabella in 1763. Both were claimed by smallpox, the deadliest disease of early modern Europe. By the time Maria Louisa's mother died in 1759, there had already been considerable thought given to who she would marry, with Prince Louis, Duke of Burgundy in France, considered as a possible match. Yet, he died of tuberculosis in 1761, when he was just 9. Thereafter, a marriage to Prince Charles, the son and heir of King Charles III of Spain, was proposed. Negotiations followed, and on the 4th of September 1765, the marriage was consecrated at La Granja Palace near Segovia, north of Madrid. Maria Louisa was just 13 years old, while Charles was 16, and the pair were first cousins. The marriage was a difficult one in its early years for Maria Louisa. Charles's mother, Maria Amelia, had died some years earlier, and with Charles as heir to the Spanish throne, Maria Louisa became the first lady of the Spanish court. Several of her relatives, though, took a dislike to her, in large part owing to her perceived domineering attitude towards her husband, an impressionable young man who never emerged as a strong heir or ruler. Maria Louisa's marriage did not result in children for several years, and when it did, it was overshadowed by miscarriages and the death of several of her and Charles's children. This was not an uncommon development. Infant and child mortality were extremely high in early modern times, with 30 to 35% of children dying before they reached their 10th year. Furthermore, infant and child mortality was especially severe amongst some of Europe's royal lines, a product of the close intermarriage of the royal houses. Queen Anne of Britain, for instance, had been pregnant 14 times in the late 17th century, and had lost all of her children through miscarriages, or death in infancy or childhood. Maria Louisa was slightly better off than Anne. She is believed to have experienced 24 different pregnancies. 10 of these resulted in miscarriages, but 14 went to full term. Of the 14 children that she gave birth to, 7 would survive to become adults. 7 others died in infancy or childhood, and owing to this, gossip started to circulate at the Spanish court that Maria Louisa was cursed. Her and Charles's firstborn, a boy named Charles Clemente, born in September 1771, died when just 2.5 years old in March 1774. A daughter named Maria Louisa after her mother died at 4.5 years in the summer of 1782. Twins named Charles and Philip, or Carlos and Felipe to use the Hispanic versions of their names, were born in September 1783, but they were sickly from birth, and both died within 3.5 weeks of each other in 1784. The 7 children who lived into their adult years were Carlota, born in 1775, Maria Amelia, born in 1779, Maria Louisa, born in 1782, Ferdinand, born in 1784, Carlos, born in 1788, Maria Isabel, born in 1789, and Francisco, born in 1794. Several of these would become kings and queens of various European states. Curiously, Maria Louisa is understood to have experienced a miscarriage as late as 1799, by which time she was into her late 40s and might have been expected to be post-menopause. By then, her torturous natal history had taken its toll. Though noted as being an attractive woman in the 1770s when she was in her 20s, by the 1780s, Maria Louisa was prematurely aged, with many noticing that there was a jaundiced yellow tinge to her skin by her 30s, a product perhaps of her seemingly endless pregnancies and many miscarriages. Maria Louisa's father-in-law, King Charles III, died in the winter of 1788, and her husband succeeded as King Charles IV. He would rule for the next 20 years. Maria Louisa became queen consort in tandem. She was soon understood to be a major figure behind the throne. Her husband was not a strong ruler, and was imposed upon by his wife. For instance, she attended the first meeting with the senior councillors of state in 1788, and made it clear that she intended to play a role in the governance of the country, something which continued throughout the reign. Charles was content to allow this, as his passions primarily lay in hunting and other leisurely pursuits of the aristocracy. For her part, Maria Louisa played a much greater role in state affairs, and in particular in promoting education and culture in Spain. Also, she was the primary patron of Francisco Goya, who became the official court painter in the 1790s. During Maria Louisa's life at court, there were endless accusations whispered behind closed doors that she engaged in serial infidelity, taking many different lovers. One specific rumour alleged that she was having an affair with Manuel de Godoy, a young man who in the 1790s rose to become the Prime Minister of Spain as Secretary of State. His youth, quick rise to power, and patronage by the Queen, along with his close relationship with her, gave rise to intense suspicions that the two were engaged in a romance over many years. Furthermore, Maria Louisa relied on Godoy emotionally through turbulent times, such as when she lost her children and the depression caused by her menopause. Godoy was also rumoured to be the biological father of several of her children, and the Queen's confessor wrote in his last will that none of her sons and daughters, none was of their legitimate marriage. Although many historians think that the relationship was likely, we actually have very little concrete evidence that confirms this. These accusations seem to have been so prevalent owing to the jealousy amongst Godoy's rivals for power, and because the Queen was exceeding the constraints which were imposed on women in a male-dominated world. The malicious rumour mill also extended to Maria Louisa's relationships with several other senior female aristocrats at the Spanish court. For example, it was suspected that she had poisoned Maria Cayetana de Silva, 13th Duchess of Alba. The Duchess of Alba had married the Marquis of Villafranca, and this union of two prominent Spanish aristocratic lines had made them extremely senior at the Spanish royal court, second only to the royal family and the House of Osuna. Maria Luisa was seen as a rival to both the Duchess of Alba and Osuna as a result. Thus, when the Duchess of Alba suddenly died in the summer of 1802, at just 40 years of age, her passing was viewed as suspicious, and accusations that the Queen had organised for her rival to be poisoned circulated. These allegations were completely spurious, and nearly all historians agree that Alba died from tuberculosis, complicated by severe fever. Nevertheless, this wasn't the only woman Maria Luisa was rumoured to have poisoned. In 1802, her son Prince Ferdinand married Maria Antonia of Naples in Sicily. Maria Luisa disliked her daughter-in-law, once writing to Manuel Godoy, "What shall we do with that diabolical serpent of my daughter-in-law, and that cowardly mongrel of a son of mine?" The animosity between the two, and the fact that she was just 21 led to accusations that she was poisoned, but there is no evidence to support this, and Maria Antonia actually died from tuberculosis. By the 1800s, those at the centre of power in Spain had greater issues to worry about than the perceived infidelities of the Queen Consort, or a fabricated story about a possible poisoning. A much more real and tangible threat had emerged in Western Europe. In 1789, the French Revolution had begun, leading eventually in the early 1790s to the deposition and execution of King Louis XVI of France, Maria Louisa's cousin. In the French Revolutionary Wars which followed, King Charles and his government had understandably joined an anti-French coalition along with Britain and Austria against the French. But when the French began to gain the upper hand over their enemies in 1794, Charles, Maria Luisa, Godoy, and others in charge in Madrid surprisingly changed course. An alliance was entered into with the new French Republic, one which saw Spain become France's foremost ally amongst the European powers. The Franco-Spanish alliance was always an uneven one. Spain was a second-tier power in Europe by the late 18th century, and France was ascendant as the dominant continental power under the Republic. But this became even more acute under Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of the French from 1804 onwards. In 1807, Maria Luisa, Charles and Godoy attempted to take advantage of French expansion by agreeing to the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which would allow Spain to effectively invade and annex Portugal, a power which was closely allied to France's main enemy, Britain. What followed was a period of pronounced intervention in Spanish affairs by the French, culminating eventually in the deposition of Charles and the brief accession as king Charles and Maria Luisa's eldest son Ferdinand, a figure who had become increasingly opposed to his weak-willed father over the years. Maria Luisa and Charles appealed to Napoleon about this new arrangement, but their protestations had an even worse outcome when Napoleon decided to dispense with the Spanish royal family altogether. In the summer of 1808, he imposed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as the new King of Spain. With this, Maria Luisa's time at the centre of power in Madrid came to an end, though the new arrangement was a disaster for Napoleon, with a long-running guerrilla war breaking out in Spain, one which swallowed up so many French resources in the late 1800s and early 1810s that it became known as the Spanish Ulcer. With Charles's abdication and then the deposition of Ferdinand in favour of Joseph in 1808, Maria Luisa, her husband, and Godoy left Spain and spent much of the late 1800s and early 1810s as quasi-prisoners in France. They lived in pleasant conditions in Aix-en-Provence and in Marseille, but they were under a form of political detention at the same time, to prevent them becoming a source of political discontent should they return to Spain. In 1812, the former king and queen and their followers were allowed to relocate to Italy, where they lived for a time in Rome under the patronage of the papacy. Events were shifting rapidly by then, and as Napoleon's empire crumbled in the mid-1810s, following a disastrous military invasion of Russia, Ferdinand returned to Spain and reclaimed the throne there. He prohibited his parents from returning to Madrid. Thus, Maria Luisa and her husband spent their remaining years living in Rome. It was a hardly unpleasant retirement, one spent as close confidants of the papacy and amassing a valuable art collection. She died in the Eternal City on the 2nd of January 1819 at 67 years of age. Charles died just 2.5 weeks later. Godoy, meanwhile, would live for over 3 decades longer. Maria Luisa had named him as a primary beneficiary of her will, and Charles had quickly asked him to vacate their court in exile after her death. Perhaps the rumours were true after all. We may never know for sure. Next, we will be looking into the only queen regnant in the history of unified Spain, whose reign was filled with palace intrigue, rumours, conspiracies, and much more. The woman who would rule Spain as Queen Isabella II was born at the royal palace in Madrid on the 10th of October 1830. She was the elder daughter of King Ferdinand VII, who had ruled Spain on and off again since 1808 in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, and her mother was Queen Maria Cristina of Spain. Ferdinand had numerous children during his lifetime, but all of these had either died in infancy or were girls. This was problematic as Spain had long adhered to Salic law, an element of the Frankish law code which went back to the 6th century, and which stipulated that females could not succeed to the throne of a nation. Thus, in 1830, Ferdinand had issued a pragmatic sanction to ensure that a daughter of his could succeed him if he died without a male heir. Whoever was to succeed to the throne in Spain would be inheriting a country mired in trouble. As recently as the 16th century, Spain had been the world's most powerful nation, its great empire extending across the Americas, from which it derived enormous wealth in the shape of gold and silver bullion from Mexico, Peru and Bolivia. But Spain's wealth had been its undoing. It failed to innovate and develop a capitalist trading proto-industrial economy, such as had emerged in England, the Dutch Republic and Germany. And then the bullion dried up from the New World, leaving Spain an archaic backwards nation. Moreover, in the early 19th century it had lost a vast majority of its empire, as nations like Mexico, Argentina, Gran Colombia and Peru established their independence. This was the nation Isabella would soon rule. In the end, Isabella would not have to wait long before she came to the throne. Her father died in late September 1833, aged 48, when Isabella was still shy of her 3rd birthday. She now succeeded as Queen Isabella II of Spain, the first queen regnant of Spain since it united into one nation in the early 16th century. One has to go back to the early 1500s and the time of Juana la Loca or Joanna the Mad to find an earlier queen regnant, Juana having been the nominal Queen of Castile from 1504 and Queen of Aragon from 1516 to her death in 1555. Not all were willing to accept this new dispensation though. Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos believed he was the rightful heir and tried to claim the throne himself. This led to a civil war known as the First Carlist War, which would drag on for 7 bloody years. Isabella's mother Maria Cristina led her cause, and they eventually emerged victorious, but in order to do so, she was forced to make extensive concessions to the Spanish army, liberals and other elements within Spanish society in order to win their support. During these years, young Isabella was loved by many, and she was seen in the country as a symbol of liberty, peace and union. Yet behind closed doors, Isabella enjoyed a pampered upbringing. As it would be many years before Isabella could rule Spain in her own right, in the interim, the government was headed by her mother. Maria Cristina used this position to make herself extremely rich, but in 1840, she was forced to renounce the regency. This was because in December 1833, just 3 months after her husband's death, she had secretly remarried a low-ranking soldier. When news of this became public years later, she became deeply unpopular, and as a result from 1840 onwards, Baldomero Espartero, the most successful, most popular Isabelan general, took on the role. One notable accomplishment during the regency of Isabella's mother was the promulgation of a new Spanish constitution in 1837, one which was significantly more liberal than Spain's earlier governing documents, and which sought to reform the country and bring it into the modern era. In 1843, Isabella turned 13, and she was declared to be fit to rule herself, assuming the full powers and responsibilities of the throne. Yet, most accounts state that she was ill-educated, ignorant, and, though cheerful, often lazy. This period was known as the Moderate Decade, as a conservative retrenchment took place in Spanish politics, and although Isabella was now queen regnant, the reality was that Spain was still significantly dominated by politicians and other senior officials. On the 10th of October 1846, Isabella's 16th birthday, she married Francisco de Assis, Duke of Cadiz, a man in his mid-20s and her double first cousin, a not unfamiliar development in Spain, where the royal family had been severely inbred for centuries. That same day, Isabella's younger sister Infanta Luisa Fernanda also married. Isabella's new husband was one of Spain's most senior aristocrats, but the marriage was arranged for political reasons, to lend stability to what was a very weak regime at the time. Isabella disliked Francisco's effete mannerisms from their first meeting, and clearly indicated a preference for marrying Francisco's younger brother, Enrique, Duke of Seville. Years later, she allegedly said of her husband, "What shall I tell you about a man whom I saw wearing more lace than I was wearing on our wedding night?" Isabella became pregnant on 12 occasions over the next 20 years. However, from these only 5 children survived into adulthood. In the other instances, Isabella either suffered miscarriages or her children died in childbirth or their infant years, a higher than average rate for child mortality by the mid-19th century, when natal survival rates were improving noticeably. The eldest of their children to survive was a girl named Isabel for her mother, born in 1851. Alfonso was born in 1857, and as we will see, played a significant role in his mother's later life. Then, between 1861 and 1864, 3 more daughters were born, somewhat confusingly all called Maria. These were Maria del Pilar, Maria de la Paz, and Maria Eulalia. There was speculation at the time and ever since that Francisco did not father all of these children, and that he may have been gay and or impotent. The marriage was a huge failure, and Isabella took on many lovers, with rumours of her infidelity quickly spreading throughout Spain and the rest of Europe. Despite this, Francisco recognised every child, though it's believed he would often blackmail the Queen for money in exchange for keeping his mouth shut. Indeed, early on in their marriage in 1847, her dislike of her husband caused a political scandal when she made publicly known her affections for General Francisco Serrano, Duke of La Torre, a man 20 years her senior, and indicated her willingness to divorce her husband to marry him. This proposal never materialised, and Serrano was subtly moved away from Madrid by power brokers within the government. But it was an early indication of the poor state of Isabella and Francisco's marriage, and with this, the negative public image of the Queen began to grow. Isabella might be said to have started to rule properly in the 1850s as she entered her adult years. It was a tumultuous period, one which began with Isabella narrowly escaping an assassination attempt. On the 2nd of February 1852, as Isabella was leaving the chapel of the royal palace, a Catholic priest and liberal activist by the name of Martín Merino y Gómez approached her, given the impression that he needed to deliver her a message. Once he got close enough, Martín tried to stab her through the chest, but luckily, Isabella's corset saved her, deflecting much of the blow. Although physically she came away with only a minor incision at the right side of the belly, mentally the event left her terrified, while her assailant was quickly seized, questioned and executed. In the summer of 1854, the Progressive Party managed to seize power in Madrid. Led by Francisco Martínez de la Rosa and Leopoldo O'Donnell, these sought to reform the Spanish government in order to root out endemic levels of corruption within it, and to begin modernizing Spain's economy, political culture and intellectual thought. For them, Spain was markedly backwards, and behind the rest of Europe. It needed to be overhauled as a society in order to restore Spain's position as a major European power. In declaring this to be their aspiration, they stated that they wanted to preserve the monarchy, but that they believed the court culture which had surrounded the rulers of Spain for centuries needed drastic reform. Thus, Isabella was to be hauled into the process of reform whether she liked it or not, and all signs were that she was opposed to such modernising tendencies. The reform movement was at its most intense between 1854 and 1856. Government bureaucracy was overhauled, the tax collection system was improved, and peculation amongst Spanish officials was cracked down on. Ideas which had surfaced across Europe in the 18th century, such as a reduction in censorship and freedom of political association, ideas which were taken for granted in countries like England by the 1850s, were first permitted in Spain at this time as the reformers sought to create a modern nation state. Land ownership was also looked into to break up the huge land estates held by the aristocratic class and create a more efficient class of smallholders, while there was also an interest in developing a modern railway system across the country. Isabella did not attempt to block these measures, but it was clear that she was no ally of O'Donnell and de la Rosa, and the other progressives within government. Ultimately, the progressive movement burned itself out within a few short years in the 1850s. A new liberal constitution, for instance, was devised in 1856, but it was never put into effect, as reactionary elements within government sought to claim power. These more moderate elements succeeded in securing authority, both because Isabella was more favourable towards them, and also because they oversaw a successful foreign policy, one which engaged in war with Morocco in the late 1850s, and retook the island of Santo Domingo in the Caribbean in the early 1860s, after nearly 2 decades of Dominican independence. The latter project was proposed directly to Isabella by General Pedro Santana in 1860, to which she gave her explicit approval. So, although in many respects she was a ceremonial monarch for much of her reign, this is one area in which Isabella played a direct role in affairs. By the time Santo Domingo was reclaimed for Spain, Isabella was a profoundly unpopular ruler amongst large sections of the Spanish population. They saw her reign as one of scandal, intrigue and decadence, and viewed Isabella as a vain, stupid, overweight, nymphomaniac queen who was incapable of doing her job and was simply an impediment to any reform in the country. In the autumn of 1866, a large gathering of disaffected individuals from within the democratic and progressive movements occurred at the city of Ostend in Belgium. Many of those involved were individuals who had played a role in the progressive movement in the mid-1850s and were subsequently disappointed by Isabella's conservative instincts and desired to appoint conservative or moderate ministers to run the Spanish government. At Ostend, they agreed a pact to try and topple Isabella and begin a major reform program in Spain. On the 7th of July 1868, Isabella's sister and brother-in-law were linked to a conspiracy against the crown, and she decided to banish them. This was a sign of things to come. What is known as the Glorious Revolution in Spain occurred in September 1868 as a direct consequence of the earlier Pact of Ostend. It began with a naval revolt in the port city of Cadiz and was accompanied by simultaneous revolts in Madrid and other cities and towns. Isabella was not immediately overthrown and managed to rally her supporters in the first days of the revolt. But eventually the generals who were once loyal to her, including her favourite lover, abandoned her, and with the defeat of the royalist army at the Battle of Alcolea on the 28th of September, Isabella's cause was doomed. Accepting this, she headed with her family and entourage over the Pyrenees to Biarritz in southern France, where she intended to live in exile. She left Spain on the 30th of September 1868, the date which is typically seen as marking the end of her 35-year reign. Following her deposition, Isabella and the rest of the royal family made their life in France. During this time, the former queen resided on the Rue de Rivoli in Paris. Back in Spain, the revolution continued, with the brief crowning of Amadeo as King of Spain. He was an Italian prince from the House of Savoy, and the second son of Victor Emmanuel II of Italy. But in the mid-1870s, an arrangement was reached whereby Isabella formally renounced her throne, and her son and heir Alfonso was recognised as King of Spain in December 1874. He returned to the country which he ruled for the next 11 years until his premature death, but Isabella would never return to Spain for any prolonged period of time. Isabella lived into the early 20th century, mostly in Paris during the Belle Epoque, though she returned home for a brief period of time following Alfonso's accession. On that occasion, she found that she was effectively prohibited from entering Madrid, and so returned to the French capital. There she was in a relationship with the chief of her staff, Ramiro de la Puente, for many years. It was a quiet and unremarkable extended retirement for a woman who was remembered as a poor ruler of Spain, one who was unable to respond effectively to the multiple calls for reform which were brewing in the 1850s and 1860s. Isabella died on the 9th of April 1904, aged 73, likely from influenza. Her body was transported back to Spain for burial next to her predecessors as kings of Spain at El Escorial Palace. Her funeral took place on the 16th of April at San Francisco el Grande. Queen Isabella II of Spain has come to be known historically in her country as La Reina Castiza and La de los Tristes Destinos, meaning the traditional queen and the queen of sad mischance respectively in English. Our next queen, like so many others in history, was a foreigner. She was active in social projects, learned the language, but her lavish spending and the monarchy as a whole was definitely unpopular, leading to tragedy. Maria Amelia, or Amélie, as she was more commonly known, was born on the 28th of September 1865 in Twickenham in London, England. Her parents were Prince Philippe of Orléans, the Count of Paris, and Marie Isabelle of Orléans. Her grandfather was Prince Ferdinand Philippe of Orléans, and her great-grandfather was King Louis Philippe I, the Orleanist King of France from 1830 to 1848. His reign ended as the French monarchy had been overthrown in a series of revolts which had swept across Europe in 1848. Thus, when the Second French Republic was established at that time, the Orleanist royal family had headed into exile, and it is for this reason that Maria Amélie was born in England. Her early years were spent in exile there, but in 1870, Napoleon III of France, who had become president of the country in 1848 and later made himself Emperor of the French, was overthrown. Then, following French defeat in the short-lived Franco-Prussian War in 1871, a third French Republic was created. As a result, 6-year-old Amélie and her family were finally allowed to return to France. Her father, Prince Philippe, hoped to press a claim to the French throne again one day, but this never proved possible. The family split its time in the 1870s and early 1880s between Paris and an estate in Normandy in the north of the country. She was an intelligent teenager as she grew up, reading extensively, particularly about French history and archaeology, and also poetry and fiction. As was still typical of the upper class in the late 19th century, she learned Latin and also some German. Amélie also became a keen drawer and painter. With their return to France, and the lingering possibility of a restoration of the monarchy in France, if only in a purely symbolic role, Amélie became an attractive marriage prospect for Europe's royal houses in an age when the continent's royal families were all enmeshed through complex marital bonds. Thus, in the mid-1880s, as she entered her adult years, a marriage arrangement was concluded whereby Amélie would marry Carlos, the Crown Prince of Portugal and heir to his father, King Luis. The wedding was celebrated on the 22nd of May 1886. Unlike many such marriages, there was not a major age difference. She was 21 and he was 23. On her wedding day in the Portuguese capital of Lisbon, Amélie wore an elaborate decorated mantle or flowing gown which had been gifted to her for the celebration of her nuptials by the city of Paris. It was fashioned out of rose-coloured velvet and lined with silver embroidery with phytomorphic motifs all around. The edge was also trimmed with satin frills. Amélie would only wear it again on 2 further occasions, when meeting Pope Leo XIII in Lisbon in 1892, and when celebrating the 12th birthday of her eldest child, Luis Felipe, in 1899. it remains part of the Portuguese crown jewels today. Their marriage would soon result in children. Luís Felipe, the Duke of Braganza, was born on the 21st of March 1887, just 10 months after their marriage. A daughter, Infanta Maria Ana, was born prematurely on the 14th of December 1887 and died in childbirth. Their third and final child, another son named Manuel, was welcomed nearly 2 years after that, on the 15th of November 1889. King Louis died prematurely on the 19th of October 1889, when he was just 50 years of age. As a consequence, Carlos ascended to the throne just after his 26th birthday, becoming King Carlos I. Amélie now became the Queen Consort at just 24 years of age. By now, she was beginning to acclimatise to her new homeland. She had arrived a young woman who didn't even speak the language, but by 1889 her Portuguese was sufficient to converse freely with her subjects. However, she did find court life with its formality and endless ceremonies oppressive. There were troubles beyond the overt formality of the court. Portugal had once been a proud imperial power which had punched well above its weight on the world stage by colonising Brazil, parts of Africa, and carving out a trading empire at strategic sites across the Indian Ocean. But those days were long gone by the late 19th century, and Portugal had become one of Europe's poorest countries. The loss of Brazil and other large overseas territories was only barely compensated for by the acquisition of new colonies in Angola and Mozambique. However, efforts to carve out a continuous corridor of land across the breadth of southern Africa, the so-called Pink Map strategy, were ended soon after Carlos and Amélie came to the throne. In 1890, the British issued an ultimatum whereby they effectively commanded Portugal to stop acquiring land in Africa because it would likely get in the way of Britain's ambitions to form a continuous colony from Egypt all the way south to the Cape of Good Hope. Back home, Carlos and Amélie were also unpopular owing to the failure to industrialise the Portuguese economy and the reliance on agriculture, shipbuilding, fishing, and other types of unprofitable economic activity. The people of Portugal remained generally poor as a result, and the country declared bankruptcy twice during Carlos's reign. Amélie also had to contend with marital trouble. Carlos was a serial philanderer who engaged in multiple affairs during the 1890s and 1900s. Amélie consequently found solace and meaning in charitable work. She studied medicine for 2 years at the Escola Politécnica in Lisbon, a decision she claimed to have taken in order to treat Carlos's health problems from his obesity. But in reality, her medical attentions were focused on establishing hospitals and treatment centres for patients suffering from tuberculosis, a terrible disease which was ravaging the poorer parts of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These included a sanatorium for children who had developed the condition, and also a clinic to offer palliative care to tubercular patients who were nearing death. By the mid-1900s, the unrest within Portugal had increased into outright political tensions and protests against the government and the monarchy by Republicans and Socialists. Terrorist organisations, such as the Carbonaria, had been stirring up hatred of the crown, and the media had become increasingly vocal in their criticisms of Carlos. It was surprising, given these tensions, that when the royal family were returning to Lisbon from the Ducal Palace in Alentejo on the 1st of February 1908, they were not accompanied by any major security detail. This lack of protection would prove fatal. When they passed through the Terreiro de Paz on the riverfront of Lisbon, 2 Republican agitators, Alfredo Luís da Costa and Manuel Buica, opened fire on their open-top carriage. In the resulting spray of rifle bullets, the king was killed immediately. The royal couple's eldest son, Luís Felipe, was also mortally wounded, and he died about 20 minutes after the shooting. Their other son Manuel was hit in the arm but survived. Amélie was the only member of the royal family in the carriage not to be shot, despite the fact that she had tried to cover Manuel, who was in any event hit in the arm. She even battered one of the gunmen with a bouquet of flowers she had been holding when he climbed onto the side of the carriage. Thereafter, the two assassins were killed on the spot once the limited royal bodyguard responded. But it was too late. With a spray of bullets near the River Tagus, on the 1st of February 1908, Amélie's husband was killed and she ceased to be the queen consort. Thereafter, her 18-year-old son became King Manuel II of Portugal, yet the country would never know another queen. Unfortunately, Manuel's succession did not bring any stability to Portugal. Rather, it compounded the instability. As little more than a teenager, the young monarch lacked credibility and maturity at a time when the country needed a firm hand to steady the ship. It was made clear to him from the very start that he would not find allies amongst the increasingly powerful Republican faction. As one such individual, the anti-monarchist journalist João Chagas warned Manuel, "Your Highness arrives too young into a very old world." Nevertheless, Manuel, advised by his mother, did try. He nominated a consensus government which included monarchists and republicans. Legislative elections were called for in April 1908 to try and quell the public unrest, but none of it proved sufficient. The economic crisis continued, and with it, the political instability. The end of the monarchy and the Braganza line of Portuguese kings finally came in the autumn of 1910. On the 3rd of October, a rebellion broke out in several locations around the country and spread quickly the following day. The Portuguese military proved reluctant to obey orders to suppress the insurrection. For instance, the civil police and the fiscal guard simply stayed in their barracks rather than move against the political agitators. On the evening of the 4th of October, Manuel and his mother were consequently advised to temporarily leave Lisbon before the royal palace was stormed. This was the beginning of the end. The following morning at 9 a.m. on the 5th of October, a Portuguese republic was declared from the balcony of Lisbon City Hall in the centre of the capital. By that stage, the king and his mother and their followers had boarded the royal yacht Amelia, named after the former queen. Initially, they planned to make for Porto, but when they learned that Portugal's second city had also joined the revolt, they realised it was futile. Accordingly, they set sail for British-held Gibraltar, and from there headed into a life in exile in Britain. In Lisbon, in the aftermath of the October Revolution, a provisional government was formed, led by Teófilo Braga, a leading Republican, and in 1911, a new constitution was approved, and with it, the first Portuguese republic came into being. In the aftermath of the October 1910 revolution, Amélie and Manuel headed for England and took up residence in Twickenham, where Amélie had been born in exile as part of the former French royal family. This must have made her one of very few individuals who ended up living in the same place in London 40 years apart as a result of a royal family being exiled from two separate countries. In the first years of their exile, there were several conspiracies launched to try and restore Manuel to the monarchy in 1911, 1912 and 1919. From exile, he and his mother supported the Portuguese entry into the First World War and requested that the monarchists back in Portugal refrain from any efforts to overthrow the government during its duration. Following the war, and the one further brief attempt to restore Manuel again in 1919, he and his mother accepted the reality of exile. Consequently, the 1920s were lived quietly, and Manuel died suddenly and prematurely of suffocation from a tracheoedema in the summer of 1932, at the age of 42. Amélie spent much of her later years in France, her ancestral homeland. During the Second World War, she was invited to return to Portugal to live there, but other than a brief visit in 1945, when the war ended, She lived out her remaining years in France. She died there on the 25th of October 1951 at 86 years of age. For our final story, we are looking into one of Queen Victoria's grandchildren, who became queen of a country that had a knack for disliking their queens. Princess Victoria Eugenie Julia Ina was born on the 24th of October 1887 at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She was the daughter of Prince Henry of Battenberg, the son of Prince Alexander of Hessen in Western Germany. Henry's mother was the Countess Julia von Hauck, a member of a middling German Polish noble family. Because Prince Alexander had married below his station as a royal prince, his and Julia's marriage was considered a morganatic marriage in the 19th century, a marriage between two people of unequal social status. As a result of this, Henry, as their son, was not granted one of their principality's ancient titles from his father, but became known as Prince Henry of Battenberg, and he would later pass that title on to his daughter, Princess Victoria Eugenie. Victoria Eugenie's mother was Princess Beatrice, the fifth daughter of Queen Victoria I of Great Britain and Ireland. She soon became known to her family as Ina, the last of her names, while she was also referred to as the Jubilee Baby, in acknowledgement of having been born during the 50th year of Queen Victoria's reign. This also accounts for her parents' decision to name her after her grandmother. The young princess grew up in Queen Victoria's household. This was an unusual situation, but is accounted for by how attached the Queen was to Princess Beatrice, who was her youngest child. The aging Queen had only granted permission to Beatrice to marry Prince Henry on the condition that she would continue to live with her and act as her secretary. Therefore, Victoria Eugenie's youth was spent at various royal residences in England and Scotland, and she developed a close relationship with her grandmother. When Victoria died in 1901, after 64 years on the throne, Princess Beatrice moved with her children to Kensington Palace in London, her husband having died in 1896 after contracting malaria while on military service in Africa. The issue of Princess Victoria's marriage arose in 1905 when she was near her 18th birthday. That year, King Alfonso XIII of Spain visited Britain. At 19 years of age, Alfonso was just a year and a half older than Victoria, but he had already been king for nearly 2 decades at this point. His father, King Alfonso XII, had died a few months before Alfonso was born. Thus, Alfonso Jr. had become King of Spain at the time of his birth. When he arrived to England in 1905, it was well known that Alfonso was looking to get married soon, and there were rumours of a possible marriage to Princess Patricia of Connacht, a first cousin of Victoria's. However, at a state dinner at Buckingham Palace, it was Victoria who caught his eye. Yet there were a number of roadblocks to any potential union. Firstly, Victoria was an Anglican Protestant, and her religion would be problematic for any potential queen of ultra-Roman Catholic Spain. Secondly, there was a possibility that Victoria was a carrier of a rare blood disease called haemophilia, which was prominent in the British royal family at this time. If she was, it could be passed on to any children she and Alfonso might have. These problems, though, were soon overcome. Victoria agreed to convert to Roman Catholicism, while Alfonso was willing to take the risk in regard to the familial prevalence of haemophilia, though, as we will shortly see, this became a major issue in later years. With these obstacles overcome, Victoria visited Spain with her mother early in 1906, where they were hosted by Alfonso and met his mother. Behind the scenes, official dynastic arrangements and marriage terms were agreed to between the British and Spanish governments. With all this in place, the marriage was set for the 31st of May 1906, and it would be celebrated in Madrid. There would, though, be one final incident in this difficult engagement process. On the day of Alfonso and Victoria's marriage, a Spanish anarchist by the name of Mateo Morral attempted to assassinate the young king and queen by throwing a bomb disguised as a floral bouquet at them from a hotel window in central Madrid as the royal procession was making its way through the city. The royal couple were unhurt, but 24 bystanders were killed and over 100 others were injured. It boded ill for their marriage and foreshadowed the political conflict which would characterize Spanish political life in the decades that followed. Unfortunately, Victoria Eugenie's fortunes did not improve after she became Queen of Spain. She found her new homeland hard to adjust to and was unpopular amongst her new subjects, who regarded her somewhat suspiciously as a Protestant interloper who had simply converted for the sake of convenience. Things grew worse when, on the 10th of May 1907, less than a year after they were married, Victoria gave birth to a son named Alfonso, after his father. While the arrival of their first child should have been a moment for celebration for the royal couple, it soon turned sour. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the British royal family and many other European royal families had their male children circumcised. When young Alfonso was circumcised, the doctors soon reported that he kept bleeding afterwards. The prince had evidently inherited Victoria's haemophilia. Haemophilia is a condition in which an individual's blood does not clot properly. It is typically inherited genetically from generation to generation of a family. It is ultimately caused by a mutation or change in the genes an individual has, which instruct the body to make clotting factor proteins when an injury of some kind is suffered and a clot needs to be formed to staunch bleeding. Because the sufferer cannot produce these clotting proteins, even small injuries can result in extensive bleeding, while surgery or serious injuries can be extremely hazardous or even fatal. The severity of an individual's haemophilia is determined by how much of the factor which produces clotting proteins one has in their systems. In the case of Victoria and Alfonso's firstborn child, it would prove to be particularly acute. The British royal family in the 19th and early 20th centuries suffered extensively from the condition, and Victoria Eugenie had been born with it. Her grandmother, Queen Victoria, had been the first carrier, and it had descended to many of her grandchildren. It now became clear in the 1900s that Alfonso had it, and several of Victoria Eugenie's other children would subsequently suffer from the same disease. As a result, the children would have to be protected from injuries. Small bumps and scrapes, which might result in a bruise or small cut for most children, could be extremely damaging to Victoria's children. King Alfonso did not respond well to the news that young Alfonso had haemophilia. It drove a rift between him and his wife, who he blamed for this. Yet they continued to have children, in total 5 sons and 2 daughters. The health difficulties of the family were compounded when their second child, a son named Jaime, was born deaf in 1908, a year after Alfonso's birth. Thus, although their daughters Beatriz and Maria appeared to have escaped inheriting Victoria's haemophilia, the family was plagued by health difficulties. It is perhaps unsurprising to learn that Victoria threw herself into charitable work with hospitals in the years that followed. She patronized the Red Cross in Spain, and in 1929 was honored by the Catalonian city of Barcelona when they erected a statue of her in the city wearing a nurse's uniform. She also supported educational reform in Spain and provided charity for the poor. All work which saw Pope Pius XI bestow the Golden Rose on her in 1923, a major honour awarded by the Roman Catholic Church to individuals as a token of reverence. While Victoria Eugenie's charitable work proceeded well in the 1910s and 1920s, all was not well in her adopted homeland. Throughout the 19th century, Spain had been experiencing political turmoil between individuals who wanted to reform the country's politics and those who supported a more conservative society that would be dominated by the monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. This was complicated by the rise of the Spanish armed forces as a major factor in Spanish politics during a series of conflicts in North Africa where Spain was trying to protect its few remaining colonies. By the 1920s, the opposing groups were split broadly into groups of pro-monarchy army elements or nationalists and their republican opponents. To maintain his position as King of Spain, Alfonso had supported Miguel Primo de Rivera as a military governor of the country from 1923 onwards, on the platform of country, religion, monarchy. But finally, in 1930, de Rivera's power slipped as an economic collapse within Spain, following the Wall Street crash in the United States, saw him lose the support of the Spanish military. As a result, in 1931 elections were held which brought the Republicans to power across Spain. Within weeks, they deposed Alfonso and created the Second Spanish Republic in succession to the monarchy. Alfonso and Victoria Eugenie were suddenly no longer the King and Queen of Spain. Following their deposition, Alfonso and Victoria left Spain altogether. It was believed that their continued presence in the country would prove contentious and could provoke a civil war between the Republicans and those who wanted a restoration of the monarchy. Thus, they went into exile in France in the early 1930s. Nevertheless, their departure did not serve to halt the unrest in Spain. Eventually, the country descended into civil war between the left-leaning Republicans and a right-wing nationalist movement in 1936. The Spanish Civil War would last for 3 years and eventually resulted in the seizure of power by General Francisco Franco and his Falange movement. Alfonso and Victoria subsequently moved from France to Italy. For a time, there was a hope that Franco might restore the monarchy in Spain following the Civil War, but this never materialized. To compound their miseries, their fourth son Gonzalo died in 1934 as a result of a car accident. The injuries which he sustained were minor, but he suffered extensive internal bleeding as a result of his haemophilia, and this led to his death shortly afterwards. Tragically, the exact same fate befell their eldest son Alfonso 4 years later in 1938. Then, in 1941, Alfonso, who was in poor health, renounced his claim to the Spanish throne in favour of their third son Juan. The old king died shortly afterwards. Victoria Eugenie's problems continued after Alfonso's death. Prior to this, the couple had been living in Italy, a country which had allied with Germany in the Second World War against Britain. Victoria's support for her homeland was evident to Italian society, and in 1942, she was asked to leave the country. She subsequently relocated to Switzerland, a neutral country in the war, where she spent much of her later years. In 1968, as the Franco regime was liberalizing significantly during the dictator's final years in charge of Spain, she briefly returned to the country for the first time in 37 years. When Franco himself died on the 20th of November 1975, there was widespread popular support for a restoration of the monarchy, and there just 2 days later, on the 22nd of November, Victoria's grandson Juan Carlos became King Juan Carlos I of Spain in a restored monarchy. Today, Victoria's great-grandson Felipe VI is the reigning Spanish monarch. The old queen never lived to see her grandson become king though. Victoria Eugenie died in the Swiss city of Lausanne on the 15th of April 1969. At 81 years of age, she had lived a long life, though one filled with many problems. As the Franco regime was still in place, she was buried in Lausanne. However, in 1985, her grandson ensured that her remains were returned to Spain, and she was interred in the royal vault at the Escorial Palace outside Madrid, next to her husband and their children. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on these hated and disliked queens. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to let me know down below in the comments. I know there are a bunch of other queens that were probably disliked by their countries, and I'm sure I've covered a lot of them. I didn't want to overlap with another video I did on crazy queens. Also check that out down below in the link in the description and in the pinned comment. I hope you guys are subscribed and the notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. And anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.